So here I am, and very excited to see Pádraig Ó Tuama. Very great to have you here, Pádraig.
Thanks very much, Mark.
And we are about, well, not too far away. We're going down to the cathedral in a moment to talk about this new book, 44 poems on being with each other, which I have to say I think is magnificent. I will talk about that more later in the cathedral, but here, just to tell everyone, which they'll already know anyway, but you are an Irish poet and theologian. You've worked for many years in conflict resolution, and you now present the hugely admired and very popular Poetry Unbound, which again I adore. It's one of those things I listen to towards the end of my day and find it very helpful to do that. You're a great friend to the Southwark Cathedral and to me, for which I'm hugely grateful. And what I've asked is that you read just a couple of the 44 poems in this anthology, and then we'll just talk about those poems and why you chose them.
Yeah,
and so
lovely.
on. But could you just, as an introduction, tell us all a little bit about the actual anthology and why you chose this theme of on being with each other?
Yeah, so 44 poems on being with each other. There were only 40, and then Jamie Byng, the publisher of Canongate, said that he likes alliteration. Could I whack it up to 44? And when he said it, I thought, actually, I agree with you. 44 sounds lovely. I have been interested for a long time in what a group is, what happens when people come together, and what is it when people come together. I like Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, who said somewhere, a group is where anything can happen. So he defined a group by the experiential level of it, rather than its borders. And I found that so compelling. And, you know, all of us have experiences of groups, you know, the people on the bus, or the people in the classroom, or your family, or your group of friends, or, you know, the accidental group that formed when you were on holiday and a few of you met. And we've all been in groups and felt kicked out by them and all of those things. And that magnified then becomes something that is part of the project of democracy, the way that the word you, plural, is conjugated by a politician who was saying, I know what you want, when they're seeking for our vote or whatever. And so the question about group and being in groups and being with each other is personal, it's spiritual, it's political. And I thought I wanted to assemble a whole load of poems that are talking about things like that, and looking at, not to say this is comprehensive, there's no such thing as a comprehensive anthology that could do that, but I was interested in gathering well-known poets, newer poets, and seeing what would happen when we put them together, and seeing what kind of essays would emerge, and what ways, in a quiet way, we could talk about kind of theories and the artistic intelligence about human intersubjectivity.
And we're all part of various groups all through our lives, but we're not very good at seeing ourselves as part of a group quite often. It's like the fish in the water that doesn't see the water.
Yeah.
But you mention at the beginning in this book that there's an Irish word which can be translated as poet, but actually also as seer.
Yeah.
And I sense that you're bringing your seeing of the group dynamic and into this anthology.
That's the hope, yeah. I mean, I suppose like us all, you know, I've recognised things that, like it or love it, are part of my life. And I know for me, poetry and group dynamics or conflict and theology are all part of the same thing for me. At one point, I decided, well, I'm going to stop writing poems that have religious overtones. And then the first sequence of poem I wrote after that was called Our Lady of Desire. And I hadn't noticed it. And a friend of mine went, like, you can't escape yourself, Pádraig. And I just gave up at that stage and thought, look, okay, I'm always going to have these three prongs to my interests. And so, of course, I was interested in thinking, I mean, I don't want to be what's the word, where I'm putting something to purpose. You know the word. You know, I don't want to be diminutive of the purpose of a poem. I don't know what the purpose of a poem is. You know, a poem exists, and poetry has arisen everywhere. But I do think that poems can point the way to something. The good ones, anyway. They can point the way to something, some kind of intuition, a knowing and not knowing, a grief too about everything that happens in the space between people.
Yeah, there's possibility in poem, isn't there?
A possibility also.
It's a word I often put with it, with the word poem.
Yeah.
So, give us one of your first chosen poems.
This first one to read is by Rev'd. It's called Eurydice Turning. Each evening I call home and my brother answers. Each evening my rote patter, his unfailing cheer, until he swivels, leans in, louder. It's your daughter, Mum. Want to say hello to Rita? My surprise each time that he still asks, believes in asking. Hello, Rita. A good day then. The voice as fresh as I remember. I close my eyes to savour it, but don't need the dark to see her, younger than my daughter now, wasp-waisted in her home-sewn coral satin, with all of bebop yet to boogie through. No wonder Orpheus, when he heard the voice he'd played his lyre for in the only season of his life that mattered, could not believe she was anything but who she'd always been to him, for him. Silence. Open air. I know it's coming. Wait for my brother's, okay, now say goodbye, Mum. And her parroted reply, goodbye, Mum. That lucid, ghastly singing. I put myself back into a trance and keep talking. Weather, gossip, news.
Wonderful. Tell us about Rita Dove a little bit, because my guess is some listeners won't know much about Rita.
She's a great American poet. She's had so many collections of books. She had one collection of poetry that she was working on, and her house burnt down, and including the entire manuscript of the book. And she and her husband, as part of trying to get over having lost everything, decided to enroll in some ballroom dancing classes.
Gosh.
And then she wrote this whole sequence of poems about ballroom dancing in the aftermath of that. So she's brilliant. And this poem is so rich. What interests me, like every poem is about the presence of absence, because with the line break and, no poem is comprehensive, even the long ones. But what's so interesting here is the presence of the absence of argument in this poem between the brother and the sister characters. Yeah. It is so stressful. Here she is, she's in essence recognizing that she could be the mother of her mother, and the brother is so wise, just that very simple instruction at the start. It's your daughter, Mom. Want to say hello to Rita. He's telling her who she is. He's telling the mother who it is that's on the phone. And he's telling her a very simple instruction, say hello. Mm-hmm. And he's giving her the name, Rita. Mm. And so in the hospitality of this very knowledgeable sentence, he's showing us that he understands that for her, she's lost a hold of those things. And he's protecting himself, protecting the mother, protecting the sister too, the poet, Rita. And then, she says, hello, Rita. And those beautiful, devastating words, a good day then. Yes. Which goes to say, well, what was a bad day? And, you get the impression that there's just such a lot of communication happening in all this. The person who has begun to go into memory loss, who is in communication with something else, and then the family who are present with something. That lucid, ghastly singing, she refers to it at the end. And it's a living grief, the last two lines. I put myself back into a trance and keep talking. Weather, gossip, news. I always get the impression that the brother in this is like some kind of priest of a family, helping the mother, and then also helping the daughter, or his sister, the mother's daughter, and helping everything between them.
He's a real bridge.
Isn't he?
Between.
That's a lovely way to say it, yeah. And I love, it's called Eurydice Turning, Eurydice, a character who was killed by one of the gods and taken down to Hades, and her her lover, Orpheus, was so devastated that he made his way down to the underworld to sing and charm the underworld so that they'd let her come back. But I love in this how she pushes that a little bit, you know. She kind of implies that Orpheus could never let go. He was trying to raise something that could never have come back, even though it almost did, you know. In the only season of his life that mattered, could not believe she was anything but who she'd always been to him, for him. And in that way, I think Rita Dove is saying, well, my mother has always been my mother, to me, for me. And she's having to go, oh, she's something else now. She is this body, this memory, this self that isn't for me anymore, but she's around me and I'm around her. And who is it that therefore the daughter and the brother can be to the mother, for their mother, with all that change? It's...
There's a reference in it to darkness, and I've noted that in a few of the poems. And it always seems to me that you're pointing us quite often to a beauty that can be found in the dark.
Oh yeah, of course.
And there is a beauty in this poem, isn't there?
A comfort, I mean, I don't like the metaphor that you find in poetry or theology to imply that darkness equals difficulty. You know, there's a political critique of that, which you don't have to think about that too much before you realize how devastating that can be in terms of the political implications of that. But like, if there was no such thing as night, how would plants bloom? How would we rest? You know, and even when we think of, you know, the midnight sun in various poles of the earth, but then they also have the long winter night. You know, so whether it is over a 24-hour basis or over a 12-month basis, we understand that there's cycles that are absolutely necessary. You know, I met a woman years ago who said that she was going through a difficult time, and she went to speak to her priest about it, and he said he knew that things were difficult, and she was a very private person, so she was having to get over something of her own privacy in order to speak about what was happening. And he said, let's go for a drive. So they hopped in the car, and she said it was getting a little dark, and lived in the country, so they went for a drive, and she said it was such a lovely thing, the welcoming, enclosing, comforting space of the oncoming dark. The car, they didn't have to look at each other as they drove. So I think we lose so much when we don't recognize the profound richness and necessity and benevolence of dark.
I think, as well as speaking as, you know, person of faith, we talk about the light so much that we tend to think of dark as being the opposite. Whereas actually we all need a rest from the light.
Totally. Yeah, of course.
For good reason.
Yeah. And like every bulb that grows begins in darkness. You know, of course it grows towards the light, but it is found in the darkness. You know, we speak about the 7 or the 6 followed by the 7th day of creation in the opening epic poem of Genesis, but there's also the 6th and following 7th nights of creation.
I mean, the poems that you choose are often shortish, lyric poems that you might call sort of epiphanic. There's normally, in the darkness of the poem, there's normally a little spark of something which, you know, and is that a deliberate thing? Are you drawn to the lyric poem for these purposes?
I am. I mean, the shortish nature of it is because for the podcast, you know, typically our podcasts are 12 minutes, and I offer a reflection and read the poem twice, so they're inevitably going to be shortish as a result of that. And the epiphanic nature of it, I am really interested in what can be revealed and what can be seen. I try to choose poems that do that in different ways. It might be that the whole thing is about that, or that there's a turn at some point where something becomes revealed, almost like a small denouement. And some of those might be dramatic, and others of those might be very, very ordinary. So, but I am, for the purposes of something like this, I am really interested in seeing what it is that a poem shows us to see. And that happens in very different ways.
And what I sometimes say is that when I'm trying to explain why poetry to people, is that at that moment, the unforeseen becomes the indispensable.
Yes, yeah.
That's once you've seen it, it's resonated, you don't want to lose it.
Yeah.
There's something there which you want to keep.
Totally. And which becomes vital to you, and which has been there waiting for your attention.
Yeah.
I have this fantasy sometimes about what would happen if I was on a bus and for some reason the bus got delayed. Nobody's in any trouble, there's been no accident, but we have to turn to each other and have a chat, you know. I mean, probably most people would just hop on their phone. But I like the idea of thinking, what are some questions you could ask anybody sitting next to them on the bus? And one of the questions would be, tell me about a before and an after moment of your life. Mm-hmm. And everybody's had them, you know, and usually you don't choose them. You know, it may not be, that time that I worked really hard to get the promotion and I got it. Yeah. It's usually something that's out of your control, and that maybe something that you still resent and something that you wish hadn't happened, but it has created a hinge in time by which you've measured some part of your life.
Exactly. That's a wonderful poem. I didn't know it. I'd read it in the book, but to hear it read, of course, as always, poems are meant to be heard, aren't they?
Yes, poetry began as an auditory experience.
And it's good to remind ourselves of that.
Yeah.
Even when you're by yourself, to read a poem out loud,
yes, totally.
It comes into its own.
Totally.
So.
And you're shaping it with the physicality of your tongue. And there's a physical nature to poetry, an embodied nature to it.
Yes, wonderful. Take us to the second one.
Yeah. I love this poem. It's by another American poet, Jim Moore. And he's written many, many books. Fear and Love. I wish I could make the argument that a river and a sunset plus a calm disregard of the ego are enough. But whatever comes next must include tents in the parking lot, that homeless camp on the way to the airport, and the hole in your cheek from the cancer removed yesterday. I said last night, in the few seconds before I fell asleep, you do realize, don't you, everything is falling apart? You said, okay, I'll try to keep that in mind. And now it is starting to be late again, just like every other night for the last 75 years. Fear and love, a friend said in an impromptu speech at his surprise birthday party. We all live caught between fear and love. He tried to smile as he spoke, then sat down. Yesterday you saw the moon from the operating table where they were about to cut you. Look, you demanded, and the surgeon bent and turned to see it from your angle, knife in hand.
That's quite an ending, isn't it?
Isn't it? Knife in hand. What is it that strikes you about that poem?
Oh, that final image of the one who is about to seek to heal you, is stopped by you to trying to look at things from your angle and seeing the moon. Yeah. I mean, that's just an image that throws me into sort of not confusion, but I mean, there's just so much in that that's where it strikes for me. That was where the knife literally is in the poem for me. Yeah. I love, of course, us all being caught between fear and love. I mean, that seems to me to be a pretty accurate description of the human, and the whole business of, where your fears are, there your task is. Seems to me to be an important, well, not particularly a faith, but just a human endeavour that we should be pursuing. But no, that final image, that's the epiphanic moment for me. Yeah. Why did you choose that for the book?
Well, I love the wisdom of fear and love. I love the elegant turns in this poem. So from the form, you start off with somebody who's trying to say, well, I'd like to be more mindful, but the river isn't enough because I want to think about homelessness. I want to think about inequality. Yeah. And then you can get the sense of somebody intelligent and troubled by the world. And then he's next to a partner, I'm guessing, a wife, and who is, he's kind of saying, oh, look at all of this. And she's saying, yeah, that's very nice. I love the humor of that. And then the next turn, the third turn, the friend at an impromptu speech at his surprise birthday party. And there's such careful observation. We all live caught between fear and love, but it's the next line. He tried to smile as he spoke, then sat down. I can see that immediately. And not just he smiled, or a thin smile, or a wan smile. He tried to smile as he spoke. This is somebody watching somebody who says something at a party, which is about life and death. And then the final turn, it goes back to this the lyric address of the poem. And what we see here is surgeon and patient, where the encounter between them, where they're obviously, one's got the knife in hand and the other's about to have some surgery done on them, something turns and one is pointing towards something that only they can see from their vantage point. It's beautiful. And it's not a kind of a triumphant, we will overcome. There's a deep spirit of wisdom, I think, in this poem that is about recognizing the ways within which we affect each other, which brings you back then to the people who are homeless, that their lives are affecting him, and he's trying to learn how to see it and trying to have his seeing changed.
And nor is it pursuing that slightly overdone, I think, and rather tired image of the wounded healer.
Oh, no.
Because my experience of human beings is most of us are unhealed wounders.
Yeah, very nicely said. Oh, no. Yeah, there's no trope in this.
No, it's not trite. It's really confronting us with the hard realities, and yet doesn't leave us hopeless.
No. I mean, there's unnarrated conversations behind this, because that final turn, yesterday you saw the moon from the operating table where they were about to cut you. Presumably the patient told the poet this, to say, this is what happened just beforehand, whether it was a general or a local anesthetic, we don't know, or, all of these things are left out, rightly so, because otherwise, it wouldn't be a poem. But so this person told the poet what they had said, and that they had been caught up and maybe sustained by the moon, that thing that's beyond. I like it such a lot. I also like, and I'm intrigued by poems that incorporate conversation and quotes and engagement. You do realize, don't you, everything is falling apart. You said, okay, I'll try to keep that in mind. And then the other friend, fear and love, and then the look at the end. The look, I think, this imperative of a one word is trying to say, be in the world. You and I both are, you formally and me sometimes resentfully, incorporated into things that people would say, you do some spiritual work, you can't get away from it, whereas I try all the time because I don't work for God. And so in spirituality sometimes there can be this implication of the opposition between the spiritual and the secular. And I can't stand that opposition, because the opposite of spirituality is suffocation. Spirit means breathe. And so the secular is what fascinates me, and I think in the secular you see the alive, the meaning, the meaningful, the macabre, everything is just there, the monstrous, and all of those are fascinating to me. It's why I love being in cities, because it's all right there. The human nature is all present to you. And we can often be encouraged to go beneath the surface, but in a city and in human encounter, actually everything's on the surface. It's there if you can only see it. And so the look at the end of that poem, the instruction from this person who's about to have something cut, where the surgeon was about to cut you, not operate on you. Like, there's a brutality to this language that Jim Moore chooses. And I like the idea of honing your capacity to look through poetry, because we're in the world and sharp things happen, and it's good to see them.
Well, and of course, I couldn't agree with you more. I find cheap and easy talk about faith as if it's some sort of escape from that world. You know, we're supposed to believe in incarnation, not excarnation. Excarnation is when you're living in the head, or you're living in fantasy or illusions. But there is a lot of easy talk, as if, you know, the whole enterprise is really just an escape. For me, it's not of interest, really.
No.
It's either in this world or nothing.
Yeah, completely. The American poet Mary Carr has a line in one of her books when she talks about the etymology of incarnation, and she looks at carne in the middle of that, meat, but also carnal.
Yes,
you know, and
yes.
I love the permission, therefore, that looking at the components of that word gives you to think, well, if you are to consider incarnational living or even incarnational theological considerations, well, then you're being asked to consider the meat of things, because the meat of things might be the absolute presence. I did a pontifical undergrad in theology, and had to, as far as that college was concerned, philosophy stopped with Thomas Aquinas. Everything after that is irrelevant, really. I quoted Kierkegaard in one of my essays once, and I got it was underlined. It was Kierkegaard on Job, and I got it underlined by the fellow who was correcting or marking the essay, and it said inappropriate and unnecessary.
The comment or him?
Both. I didn't do very well on that essay. But why was I going on about philosophy? Well, because there's something where I think we can sometimes imply that what matters between the body and the soul is the soul.
Yes.
And certainly a lot of scholastic philosophy was utterly caught up with this question of the soul. But I know that so many of those philosophies, as they progress, finally also come back around to the fact that there is no thinking without the meat of the brain, the meat of the tongue, the meat of the hand and the skeleton and all of those things, and all of the abilities and disabilities we live with, and the way that we disable each other, that we are all embodied beings, and that is possibly as important as what it is we think happens in our head.
And I mean, finally, you've brought out a new collection of your own poems as well, Kitchen Hymns, which again is a wonderful collection, I think. And I'm struck as somebody who's been reading you now for quite a while.
You could also say too many years.
And knowing you a little bit, I think I see an erosion of these easy divisions between themes and, even the word God, which it seems to me you're much more tentative around now than perhaps you were in the past.
Yeah.
And these sort of easy titles of things we have, like we just live in an endless sort of cutlery drawer and everything's in its place. This seems to be more eroded now, in a glorious way, by the way, I think.
Thanks.
Do you see what I'm trying to get at there?
Yeah. I suppose I am interested in integration, to look at it from another point of view. There's a whole sequence of poems in the book called Do You Believe in God? And they all have the same title, 16 of them.
Yeah.
And lots of them are responding to the bigness of that question in a narrative, So there's one about me and my dad and my granddad driving down to Kerry along famine roads that were built by starving people. These roads that just go up and down hills, terrible. And then there's another poem. There's some erotic poems in that about being a gay man, trying to learn about my own body and my own desire in an environment where I'd been told that I'd have to divorce those things from myself if I wanted to survive. And that for me is the erosion and the integration, I suppose, of these powerful instincts in all of us. The instinct for yearning for another person, for companionship, for erotic experience, for a relationship to history, a relationship to your country's past, a relationship to change, a relationship to prayer. I wanted to find them all together. There's another sequence in the book where Jesus is leaving Hades, and he's bewildered and shocked, and he doesn't know the way out. He sees somebody ahead of him and follows her, and it's Persephone, she who's left Hades every year at spring, forever, literally. You know, she is spring and winter, and so he follows her out past the gate, and she holds the gate open for him, but she doesn't turn around, because she's the one who, in the mythology, she's the one who made that condition for Orpheus and Eurydice. And so they become friends and lovers, and they explore serious questions with each other. And in many ways I was curious about trying to take, you know, that line that you see in the Gospels, why have you forsaken me, and the idea of becoming the abandoned that you find in theological imagination about the harrowing of hell. I thought, well, what would it be like if he really was the abandoned, if he became agnostic, if he lost all the certitude of who it is he thought he was, and if belief crumbled, who would he be and what questions would he ask? And wouldn't it be nice for him to meet somebody who was his equal for once, you know, where he's like, well, you know, God's my father. And she's going, yeah, me too. You know, in fact, I've got two, you know, Demeter and Zeus are her parents. And I was interested in them both exploring trauma, you know, not as a kind of a badge to say I'm traumatized, so therefore don't ask me something, but both of them are trying to figure out, what do you do after you've been to hell and back? And he asks her that, because he doesn't know how to tell the story. And she's been telling it forever. And like she says to them, I tell people I've been to hell and back, and then they say, oh, me too. And then they just tell her story. And she says to him at the end of that poem, time's not a line. I was interested in looking at that. And so all of these things are a matter of integrating, you know, the content of religious and mythological material with poetic form and protest, but also like I have, even if I've tried to get rid of it, a deep religious sensibility. It's my mother tongue. It's what absolutely shaped me for decades, and so it's the gate I'll always pass through. And I used to try to think, no, I need to find another mythology, and now I just think, no, it's fine. I'll pass through that gate, and let's see what's on the other side.
Yeah, well, thank goodness you do. I always love, if I can put it this way, the sort of questioning joy that you carry around with you.
Very kind.
It's a lovely combination, and you use it in so many different ways, not least in the way that you interpret and open up poems for us, but without trying to outdo the poem.
Oh God, no.
You know, W.H.
No.
Auden's saying that a poem should always be much more interesting than anything you say about it.
Oh, of course.
And yet, you know, I always think you give the poem a bit of a run for its money in that regard. So.
Well, I want to take it very seriously. Yeah. I mean, there's a huge benefit in having studied theology, which is at its heart close reading of texts that you hold to be sacred. And I want to give that attention to every poem that I write about.
Yeah. Well, I'm really looking forward to speaking to you later in the cathedral, and I know that we've got a lot of people booked up to be there to hear you, but for now, thank you so much for this conversation.